we all come across things, phenomena really, that seem to sit right at the edge of what we think we understand. Experiences that make you question, well, everything. And one area that's done this for centuries is the out-of-body experience. That feeling, that compelling sense that your consciousness is somehow separated from your physical body. Now, this isn't just about folklore. Thinkers across many different fields have really dug into this. So today, for this deep dive, we're going to step back from belief or skepticism. Instead, we'll examine this fascinating academic paper, Trends in the Study of Out-of-Body Experiences, an overview of developments since the 19th century. It gives us this really unique historical view on how OBEs have been looked at scientifically, offering some valuable insights into how we study consciousness itself.
It really does. And what's so useful about this paper is its scope, looking historically, tracing how the thinking changed within psychology, psychiatry, even parapsychology, all the way from the mid-1800s up to 1987. That time frame is just critical because it covers these huge shifts in, intellectual paradigms, how people approach studying OBEs. And it's important, like you said, that the paper aims to summarize the big trends, the concepts, not necessarily every single finding or personal story.
Exactly. So our goal here for this deep dive is to pull out those key trends, those conceptual changes that the paper lays out so well. We want to give you, the listener, a kind of structured understanding of how OBE research developed up to the late 80s. Think of it as an intellectual journey exploring the different ways people have tried to make sense of this seemingly strange but, persistently reported human experience. Okay, so let's start that journey. Let's go back to the 19th century. How were people thinking about OBEs back then?
Well, in the very early days, say before the 1880s, the main interpretations, they really centered on this idea of separation. A separation of something non-physical, call it spirit or soul, from the physical body. The core idea was that this out-of-body entity could just temporarily leave the body and even supposedly travel to distant places. What's really striking is how strongly these early ideas lean towards, spiritualistic frameworks.
Yeah, the paper mentions an anonymous writer in the American Chronological Journal back in the 1850s, and they described OBEs as a state where the independent spirit is sort of disconnected temporarily. That phrase, separate entity entirely independent of the physical organism, that really sums up that dominant early view, doesn't it? It makes you wonder what was going on culturally or philosophically that made those kinds of interpretations seem so, plausible.
That's a really good question. The 19th century, you have to remember, was buzzing with interest in spiritualism, psychic phenomena, belief in a spirit world, communication with the dead. That whole cultural context, it definitely shaped how people interpreted OBEs. Plus, scientific understanding of consciousness in the brain was pretty limited then. So spiritual explanations might seem like the only way to account for these weird experiences.
And this separate entity idea, it was tied up with another common concept, the double, or the etheric body. The paper says lots of writers use this idea to explain all sorts of psychic phenomena, not just OBEs. The basic idea was that we have this subtle counterpart to our physical body, and it could act independently. It was often linked to seeing apparitions of living people. Names like Aksav, Dacier, Kardec, Stead come up. So this wasn't some fringe belief.
Oh, not at all. The subtle body concept fit well with various philosophical ideas, occult traditions that were around. It offered what seemed like a coherent way to explain strange experiences. It gave you something, even if non-physical, to account for both feeling like you're outside your body and maybe seeing apparitions. But, as the scientific methods started to become the standard way to understand things, these purely spiritual views began to face some challenges. And Frederick W.H. Myers is a really key figure in that shift.
Myers, right. A big name in early psychical research. He brought a different angle. The paper highlights his view that OBEs, especially when they involved apparitions, might be down to some kind of psychical modification of space, which sounds quite different from a spirit literally traveling, more like some sort of mental influence at a distance, allowing for supernormal perception. How big a shift was that?
It was pretty significant. Myers didn't totally rule out some non-physical aspect, but focusing on psychical modification of space and supernormal perception. That moved the discussion. It pushed things towards a more psychological, maybe parapsychological framework. He was trying to fit these unusual experiences into a broader picture of consciousness and its hidden potentials. It definitely opened the door for explanations that didn't rely solely on a separate spirit.
And Myers' ideas, the paper notes, they influenced Edmund Gurney. He took it a step further. Gurney thought some OBEs, especially the apparition ones, could be hallucinations but induced telepathically. He started linking OBEs to other reports of ESP, extrasensory perception. What exactly would a telepathically induced hallucination mean in this context?
Okay, so Gurney's idea was that the vivid experience feeling outside your body, maybe seeing things at a distance, could be a hallucination, yes, but triggered by someone else's thoughts. So an agent somewhere else is thinking or imagining something, and that mental activity is somehow transmitted and experienced by the person having the OBE. It connected OBEs to these bigger questions about telepathy, mind-to-mind influence.
The paper brings up their collaborative work, Gurney, Myers, and Podmore, on things like reciprocal apparitions and investigating these telepathic hallucinations. That seems like a really important step, trying to find a framework that could include both psychological factors and maybe paranormal ones, sort of a middle ground between purely spiritual and purely materialistic views, early attempts at more systematic study.
Precisely. Their work definitely marked a shift towards investigating more systematically, moving beyond just collecting stories, trying to figure out possible mechanisms, whether psychological or parapsychological. And alongside these changing theories, the late 19th century also saw the first, well, pretty basic attempts at experimenting on OBEs, often using hypnosis. Subjects would be told to mentally travel somewhere distant and then report what they saw or experienced.
Fascinating, those early experiments. But the paper rightly points out the big problems, especially suggestion. If someone's hypnotized, highly suggestible, and you tell them to travel, how do you know if they're really perceiving something extrasensorially or just, following instructions and using their imagination? It's a huge challenge.
It's a fundamental issue, absolutely. It still comes up in consciousness research today. The paper mentions people like Cahegnet, who thought hypnosis could exteriorize sensation, versus Reich, who thought it was mostly memory and imagination. Even Podmore, who worked with Myers and Gurney, worried that the instructions themselves were basically creating the traveling imagery. So yeah, these early experiments were a step towards empirical work, but they were definitely limited by these methodological issues that later research would really have to grapple with.
It gives us a really good picture of the 19th century. So moving into the next phase, 1900 to 1939, what changed then? It sounds like the focus shifted quite a bit.
Yes, there was a definite shift in the early 20th century. The focus moved much more towards collecting cases, detailed descriptions. Phenomenology became really central. You see a lot more published case reports, analyses of groups of cases, really trying to capture the subjective experience. What did it feel like? But interestingly, while there was all this descriptive work, there wasn't actually that much rigorous empirical experimental research during this specific period compared to later on, which makes you wonder why the descriptive approach took hold so strongly then.
The paper mentions figures like Anonymous, Hennig, Pozzano, and especially Muldoon. Seems he wrote a lot about it. It feels like a move away from the big grand theories towards understanding the details of what people were actually reporting. Was it maybe skepticism about the earlier theories or just recognizing the complexity needed more raw data first?
Probably a mix of things. Those early theories, maybe they felt a bit too speculative, lacking solid evidence. Focusing on detailed reports allowed researchers to look for patterns, common elements in the experiences. That could potentially build a foundation for better theories later. And also, OBEs are just inherently tricky to study experimentally, right? They're subjective, often spontaneous. Maybe collecting accounts just seemed like the most practical first step.
And one thing that kept coming up in these collections was encountering apparitions of deceased people during an OBE. Hart and Hart's work in 1933 is mentioned as a key example. They noted that some people in these situations seemed fully conscious, clear memories, while others didn't. That must have raised some pretty profound questions about consciousness in these states and maybe, implications about death and what happens after. It almost sounds like OBE research was bumping up against studies of death and dying.
That's a sharp point. That intersection with questions about survival after death was definitely there, fueled by these accounts of seeing the deceased, often with this strong feeling of reality. But it's really important to remember, interpreting those accounts as proof of survival is, well, it's still incredibly complex and debated. Huge methodological challenges in verifying information, ruling out other explanations.
And the paper reminds us that the subtle body idea, the double we talked about from the 19th century, it didn't just go away. It was still a prominent explanation during this 1900-1939 period. Seems like that concept had real staying power. Why do you think it stuck around, even as more psychological ideas were emerging?
Well, it has this intuitive appeal, doesn't it? It directly mirrors the subjective feeling of being separate from your body, moving around. For someone having an OBE, the experience can feel incredibly real. So the idea of a subtle body going places offers a simple, direct explanation. Plus, it resonated with existing cultural and philosophical beliefs about non-physical aspects of being. It had that cultural familiarity.
Right. And the paper notes several authors who wrote autobiographies about their own OBEs claimed they consciously traveled places while out of body. People like D'Urville, DeRoches, Fox, Lancelin, Muldoon, and Carrington, Terrell. These first-hand stories, even though they're subjective, they must have reinforced the belief in a real, projected, subtle body that could see and act independently, like personal validation for the theories.
Exactly. These autobiographies were a rich source of qualitative data that researchers found compelling. They gave detailed descriptions, the feeling of separating, what the out-of-body world looked like, what happened. They weren't controlled experiments, obviously, but they definitely shaped how people understood OBEs at the time and kept the debate going about what was really happening.
Then the paper brings in Ernesto Bozzano, a key figure in psychical research then. He seems to have tried to systematize things, classifying phenomena related to OBEs under the term bilocation. Can you tell us more about Bozzano's system and how he thought it worked?
Bozzano's work was important for trying to bring some order to all these varied experiences. His idea of bilocation covered the exteriorization of a double. This included things like autoscopy, seeing a vision of yourself, or seeing your own physical body from outside it, phantom limb feelings, and seeing apparitions of the living or dead. And Bozzano, sticking with those subtle body theories, proposed an etheric body, was the thing doing the traveling and perceiving. His work was really an attempt to categorize and explain everything within one consistent framework.
So Bozzano was building this detailed taxonomy, all pointing back to the etheric body. But the paper also shows this was a time when alternative psychological explanations started gaining ground too. It seems that purely spiritual or subtle body models weren't the only game in town anymore. What were some of those psychological ideas?
That's a really crucial development. Researchers started thinking maybe these experiences come from altered states, internal mental processes, not an actual separate body. Hislop, for example. He didn't rule out ESP, but he suggested OBEs might involve projecting sensation to a distance, maybe shaped by imagination, expectation. That shifts the focus to the experiencer's mind playing an active role.
And then you had Bread suggesting OBEs could be a kind of subtle dream or fantasy. And Schming had a more physiological idea. Maybe physical stimuli during sleep affect blood pressure, create a feeling of lightness that the brain interprets as being outside the body. He seemed to move completely away from a non-physical entity, focusing instead on internal states, senses, how the brain interprets things. That's a big shift in thinking.
Absolutely. These alternatives show this growing understanding of how powerful the mind is at creating vivid experiences, even without a direct external cause. And Charles Courtier's idea about internal bodily sensations, synesthetic sensations, being key is really interesting for this period.
Yeah, Cartier's suggestion that the feeling of being out of body might be the dramatization in visual form of synesthetic sensations. You know, those subtle feelings of where your body is that seems quite ahead of its time. Like maybe the brain misinterprets and projects those normal body feelings, creating the sense of being disembodied, focusing on the body's signals or the brain's reading of them. That's so different from the earlier ideas. It really paves the way for what came next, right? The increasing focus on psychological and physiological roots.
It certainly does. That growing interest in internal processes really set the stage for the next period, 1940 to 1969, which saw a much more systematic, empirically driven approach.
So the paper says this period, 1940-1969, saw a move towards more structured studies, collecting larger sets of cases, using surveys to find common features, creating categories for OBEs. Sounds more data-driven.
Definitely. Hart was really influential here. He didn't just collect cases. He actually developed scales to try and measure the veridicality, basically. How accurate were the perceptions people reported having during an OBE when checked later? And he proposed different categories, like distinguishing between OBEs triggered by hypnosis versus ones that seemed more spontaneous or willful. Trying to classify and evaluate them systematically like that was a big step up in methodological rigor.
So Hart was really trying to get beyond just description, trying to measure accuracy, identify types. But interestingly, the paper says the double or subtle body idea, while maybe getting more criticism, was still being discussed, especially regarding apparitions. That old idea still had some pull.
It did. Despite the rise of psychological explanations, the sheer feeling of being out of body, plus those persistent reports of seemingly accurate perception from outside, kept the subtle body idea alive for many researchers. But at the same time, psychological investigations were really picking up steam. Krickel's work is a great example. He did extensive analysis of the psychological and physiological things people reported along with their OBEs.
Krickel's research, trying to compare OBEs to hallucinations or dreams, looking for unique psychological or physical markers, that seems crucial for figuring out if OBEs are truly distinct. And the paper mentions Hart doing a survey on how common OBEs were among college students. That suggests trying to see how widespread these are in the general population, not just among people who report unusual things.
Exactly. Getting a handle on the prevalence in a normal population is key context. Is this rare or relatively common? What factors might correlate? That kind of data helps interpret the case studies. And as the paper points out, this whole period saw ongoing debate about what OBEs fundamentally are. Is it a real projection of a subtle body, maybe with ESP involved? Or is it purely psychological, an altered state of consciousness? That was the central argument.
So a real split in approaches then. Some still looking at parapsychological angles, subtle bodies, ESP, others focusing more on altered states, internal processes, and that link to survival after death, especially with accounts involving deceased people. That question remained in the mix too.
Yes, the survival connection was still significant, though controversial. Hart and Whiteman, for instance, argued that if someone got accurate information about a deceased person during an OBE, information they couldn't have known otherwise, then maybe survival was the best explanation. The idea being maybe consciousness can exist apart from the body and survive death. That link between OBEs and these huge questions about consciousness and mortality shows just how philosophically loaded this research area is.
It really does, that complex mix of psychology, parapsychology, and deep philosophy. Okay, let's move into the final period covered by the paper, 1970 to 1987. What defined OBE research then? Sounds like things got even more focused.
The trend towards looking closely at psychological and physiological aspects became even stronger in this later period. You see much more use of standardized questionnaires, more sophisticated experiments, trying to really pin down the phenomenology, the detailed subjective experience, and the mechanisms behind OBEs. Gabbard and Twemlow's research on psychological dynamics is a good example. They're looking at psychological profiles, the context associated with people who have OBEs.
So less focus maybe on proving or disproving the subtle body and more on understanding of the psychological factors involved. The paper suggests a growing view that OBEs were probably best seen as altered states of consciousness, shaped by psychology, expectations, maybe some ESP, but not necessarily central. A more integrated multi-factor view.
Exactly. The idea took hold that OBEs probably weren't one single thing with one explanation, but complex states influenced by many factors. And with better technology like neuroimaging becoming available, interest grew in finding neurophysiological correlates. Researchers started using EEG, other physiological measures, looking for specific brain activity patterns or bodily changes during reported OBEs, trying to connect the subjective experience to objective biology.
That's a major step, trying to find a physical basis, or at least correlates. The paper also points to models focusing on internal psychological processes, body image distortion, derealization, lucid dreaming, as ways to explain OBEs. This seems like moving even further from literal travel, focusing instead on how the brain builds our sense of self and body. Palmer and Blackmore are mentioned here.
Right. Palmer's idea of OBEs as a threat to identity related to body image changes, and Blackmore's very influential model. Blackmore proposed OBEs happen when the brain's usual model of the body, which relies on constant sensory input, gets disrupted. The brain then constructs this out-of-body perspective as the best fit for the available information. These models suggest OBEs might arise from glitches in our normal sense of embodiment, our spatial awareness. Blackmore's model, especially, offered a strong psychological explanation grounded in cognitive principles without needing paranormal factors.
Blackmore's model about the disrupted body model leading to a constructed OBE view that certainly shaped a lot of modern thinking. It gives a cognitive neuroscience framework. But the paper also says that research into ESP during OBEs didn't stop entirely. Some people were still using lab settings to test for accurate perception of distant targets. So even as psychological and neurological explanations gained ground, the psychic angle wasn't totally off the table for everyone.
No, the possibility that ESP might play a role, especially when people reported perceiving things far away they couldn't have known normally, that remained an area of interest for some. Haraldson and Gustafsson's work looking at ESP scores during claimed OBEs is an example. But, as we've said, designing experiments to truly isolate ESP and rule out everything else is just incredibly difficult in parapsychology, a huge methodological challenge.
Absolutely. Controlling for sensory leakage, unconscious cues, memory biases, it's extremely hard to get definitive proof about ESP in these subjective states. Okay, so looking back over this whole sweep of history, 19th century to the late 1980s, what are the biggest takeaways, the main trends that stand out from this paper?
Well, I think the clearest trend is that shift in explanatory models. A definite arc from mostly spiritualistic, subtle body ideas in the 19th century, moving steadily towards more psychological and eventually neurophysiological investigations later on. And alongside that conceptual shift, you see the methods evolving too, from relying heavily on anecdotes and case studies towards more systematic surveys, classification systems, and attempts, at least, at controlled experiments to test specific ideas.
It really shows the field maturing, adopting more scientific rigor over time, even while the core mystery of what OBEs are remained, well, debated. And the paper makes it clear that even by the late 80s, there wasn't one single agreed-upon explanation. The field was still full of different viewpoints.
That's absolutely key. The paper stresses that divergence. The ongoing arguments about the subtle body, about ESP's role, versus the growing focus on altered states of consciousness. It highlights just how complex it is to study subjective experience scientifically, especially phenomena that seem to push the boundaries of our usual understanding.
But that trend towards better methodology later on, trying to control for bias, develop testable predictions, that's definitely progress, isn't it? And it's interesting how interdisciplinary it became: psychology, psychiatry, parapsychology, starting to touch on neurophysiology. Suggests you might need input from lots of areas to really understand it.
Yes, that interdisciplinary aspect is crucial. Bringing insights from different fields together offers the best chance for a more complete, nuanced picture, maybe bridging that gap between subjective feeling and objective measurement.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the history of OBE research up to the late 80s, based on this paper, it leaves us with a lot to think about. What's a final thought you'd like to leave with our listeners about this enduring puzzle?
I think this historical journey really forces us to think about consciousness itself. What does it mean that people consistently report these experiences? And what do the changing ways researchers have tried to understand them tell us about our own self-awareness, the mind-body connection? Definitive answers might still be out of reach, but studying OBEs, even historically, gives us valuable insights into just how complex human experience is. And maybe, just maybe, it points to the limits of our current scientific frameworks. It invites us, to stay open to the possibility that there's still more about consciousness and reality we just don't understand yet.
That's a really powerful thought to end on. Thank you for walking through this intricate history with me. It's been incredibly illuminating.
It was my pleasure. It's certainly a topic that keeps you thinking.
We really hope this exploration of the historical trends in OBE research, drawn from our source paper, has given you, our listener, a clear overview of how this fascinating phenomenon has been tackled academically over more than a century. It shows how scientific inquiry evolves, especially when dealing with experiences that are complex and often puzzling. We encourage you to think about the different viewpoints, the shifting ideas, and the questions that still drive research into consciousness today. Perhaps this deep dive has sparked your own interest to explore further.